So I'm going to pick up from where we left off yesterday with the discussions about how we deal with complexity, and thanks to John Bright and Liz Wedderburn for helping with this. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the tools that have been used a bit in the last little while around knowledge networks and report cards and wheels of water and the like. So thanks to the good work of the Land and Water Forum, there are a lot more images like this going to occur into the future, where we have groups of stakeholders doing collaborative process, trying to implement the national policy statement for freshwater management with all these sorts of things in their heads. How do we figure out our values? How do we work out what our attributes are, and how do we work through limiting factors, and how do we bring all this together to come up with a solution? This is the challenge. People need some help with this, and so I'm going to some of these tools for actually developing a shared knowledge, shared understanding of the system. So there are two sorts of things I'm going to talk to you about. One is these knowledge networks and causal loop diagrams, shown at the top here. And these are both about understanding how the whole system works. It's understanding what are the values and how is that linked to attributes. What are the drivers that cause that are driving the system and influencing the outcome of the values that come out of the system. What are our management options, and what's the consequences of intervening in the system, and what are the unintended consequences as well. Also looking at different water body types and how they vary in their resilience to the one input, so all that sort of stuff. So the other issue is people are dealing with really complex information, trying to understand what the current state is, and there are a couple of tools that have been used to condense that down into some simple messages and some ways of looking at things in an integrative way, and that's the report cards and the wheel of water. So first of all, looking at these knowledge networks, causal loop diagrams, what they are ways of summarising collective understanding of the system on one page. So we know we're dealing with complex systems. If we write a whole lot of text around it, it's like writing a book. So how can we put this on one page? The best way to do this is, a couple of ways we're using are the knowledge networks, which basically look at cause and effect single direction flow paths, and often they're used as preludes to developing Bayesian networks. The others are the loop diagrams, causal loop diagrams, which more focus on feedbacks and try to look at barriers to implementation. So they're both looking at processes where we use the sum of the knowledge of people in the room or what we know about a system in a very broad way and bring it together. And that's what they're trying to do. Ideally, they're done in a group context so that we get collective learning occurring and people have ownership of the model that comes out of it. So it's not being delivered to them by experts, it's something that they're involved in developing, and they can see themselves in the model. They can see their values in the process. This is how it's useful for collective decision making. So the idea with this is to acknowledge we've got complexity, to deal with it en route to simplification. And the models that we develop can help us with selecting attributes, making things where we've got conflicts in the system, making it transparent, but also trying to identify where we've got win-wins. And these can be refine questions that can then go to more predictive models, which is what John Bright will be talking about next. So some of the examples of these sorts of modelling systems that have been developed, there's a number of them have been used in New Zealand for both these causal loop models and knowledge networks. I got into this when I was working on the dairy best practice catchments. So there's those 5 catchments where dairying was being applied around the country. And as the process of figuring out what farmers should be focusing on in different geographies, with the one activity of dairying, but in quite contrasting geographies, from the west coast of the South Island, where you have much more rain than you need, 4 metres of rain, to the irrigated systems in South Canterbury, where you have to have irrigation in order to drive things. So you've got very different hydrologies, you've got different receiving waters, and so where you need to intervene to reduce the impacts of dairying on those is quite different in these different geographies. And so we use knowledge networks to look at those in the different places as a roadmap for how to intervene. And some of those places, like in the bog burn in Southland, Southland on the Southland Plains, which is shown in this little diagram over here, we actually finished up taking this diagram and turning it into a Bayesian network. So in the workshops, people identified what were the drivers of problems from dairying, what were the mitigations we could put in place to manage those, and how did that flow through to the drivers affecting our values, which go through to recreational water quality, Oriti, and trout and bog burn, which were the key values that came out of that. So other places we've been using them in the Hurunui, these sorts of systems were used to help bring up the thinking, bring together the thinking, which eventually went into a Bayesian network there. And the Mangatariri, as part of the Rumahanga, which we'll hear about later on, it was been used as part of the development of the whole thinking process there, and it's continuing to be used there. And in the Waipa and the Waikato, we've been using knowledge networks to particularly bring in Maori indicators into the process, and to bring in a vision maturanga into the whole process of limit setting within the Waikato, and also to underpin the report cards. So they're actually being used quite broadly around the country. So here's an example of a knowledge network that was developed by John Bright and his team as part of the Wheel of Water program, and a pilot they did in the Mangatariri, which is the subcatchment of the Rumahanga. Now, this looks pretty complex when it starts, to the drawing, and this is what was drawn up during the workshop, this drawing over here, and it's been tidied up into a tidier drawing after the workshop. Now it is complex, and that's the reality, that these are complex systems that we are working with. But however, when we tidy the diagram up here, we can see we've identified a number of different domains involved in the whole program. So we've got the economy, the land, water, ecosystem, the community, and rules and central government processes. So, and inside each, we see the key interactions within those subsystems and how they flow between the different subsystems. We tend to use a red arrow where the direction of movement is opposite between the start and the end of the arrow. So here, for example, if we do riparian planting, we tend to reduce sunlight and temperatures. And a green arrow is where things move in the same direction. So if we increase employment, we increase GDP. And we use a grey arrow where responses can be mixed depending on what happens. So it's just a general way that these things have been evolving, is the way that you can read the diagram. So if we were trying to write about how this whole system works, there are probably 30 pages of text. But here we have on one page a drawing which the community of people who are involved, the Whaitua, who have been involved in developing this, have a model that they've all agreed on about how they think the system works. So in the process of doing that, there's a whole lot of collective learning about what are our values and how do we go about setting this up, and also indicating, people have come up with what are the indicators that they're going to use. So these are the things in yellow. So that gives them some links between the things that we can measure to monitor progress and the values that we have, which often we can't measure because they're too complex. Another even scarier looking diagram is this one here, which is very complex. This is a diagram that's been pulled together as an expert approach to the same problem of how do we link up pressures, values, through the whole system of causal linkages in the Mangatariri. Now, this does look frightening. I'm going to show you some tools where we can chunk it up and work your way through the process though. But what we've got identified are the values we have that people are trying to achieve at the base here, so things like trout fishing, swimming, ecological integrity, all the different drivers that interact with those values, and the actions, the things we can intervene with in the catchment, and how they, what it is that they do. Now, this is drawn up with some freeware called YED, which people can download. So this sort of stuff is easily shared between people. And the tools that exist within YED let you drill into this. And I'm just going to show you how you can do that to move from this pretty scary looking diagram into something that people can work their way through. So if we're particularly interested in Koura, the freshwater crayfish here, we can click on the Koura node and ask, tell me about the neighbour view. So what are the proximal things that directly affect Koura? So you can click on that and it shows you that trout, eels and bed fines all reduce the number of Koura that you'll get in the stream. The positive things are their food, leaf litter input and invertebrates, and the cover habitat that they have. And what do they flow into? Well, ecological integrity, Māori and the Mahinga Kai. So that lets you look at this, break it down into chunks. If you're wanting to know about periphyte, and we talked about that quite a lot yesterday, we click on the periphyton button and the software shows you all these things that influence periphyton and why do we care about periphyton and what does it flow onto. So although we've got a big scary diagram, which is the whole picture, we can work our way through it. There are also tools you can use if interested in, say, dissolved inorganic nitrogen. What are all of the things above dissolved inorganic nitrogen? So what are the predecessors? This is the predecessor view in the same diagram, and it shows all of the actions we can do for things that will affect dissolved inorganic nitrogen, all these things here, and the drivers, and then the values that also that feed back into the system that affect dissolved inorganic nitrogen. As well as that, we can ask, well, what does dissolved organic nitrogen affect? And so that's all of its successors. So you click on the successor view and it shows you all the bits that dissolved organic nitrogen flows into. So we've got a complex system here, but we've got some tools to break it into chunks to work our way through. So the other sort of diagram that people have been using are the causal loop diagrams, and these emphasise much more the feedback loops. So they're looking at reinforcing loops and barrier loops. And this is one that was developed by Liz Wedderburn, but what it's shown is points we think we could intervene in particular where we could improve this whole system and how it works. And some of these have been improved by the NOF and the NPS, but some of the challenges still remain. So some of the things around the need for more education, knowledge transfer. But this helps people look at what are the systems and how can we actually intervene to make things better. Okay, so now moving from these knowledge networks onto report cards and the wheel of water. First, with report cards, what we're trying to do with both these systems is take a whole lot of, summarise a whole lot of complex information down into some key points that that stakeholders in a collaborative process can understand and that the public can get the idea about and see how things are going. The thing about report cards is that they draw on the common experience people have of taking a report from school home, which will have an A, B, C, D and F on it. And so people people get what that means. And it also fits in pretty nicely with the NPS process with our A, B, Cs and Ds. And we in New Zealand will probably drop off the F for fail because that's kind of what a D is. So it feeds into the system quite nicely here. And by displaying these sorts of grades, as is done here in this example for Moreton Bay in Queensland, where this work started up about a decade ago, it creates some peer pressure between people who live in different places as a motivator for action. So there are a lot of examples of how this is being used around the world, and it's increasingly being used in New Zealand. Regional councils have been using elements of report cards for quite a long time, and so here's some examples from the Waikato Regional Council's website of elements of report cards that they use. And this is good, but it doesn't actually bring things up to that highly synthetic level of what's the big picture. And often these messages sort of are sitting on websites, but people don't engage with them that much. We need to get something which actually is much more engaging than that. So with report cards, what we're trying to do is deal with the showpiece here. What's the big messages that we can tell people, but also in a context where people can drill down to find the detail about the particular values they might be interested in, but if they really want to know what's behind it, it has a basis there that it's built upon. So the project that I'll just give you a bit of an outline about is Waikato River Report Card, which is currently under development, and it's funded by the Waikato River Authority. Unlike the other report cards that have been developed in other parts of the world, which really just use biophysical indicators, this report card is incorporating cultural, social and economic values as well as the biophysical. And you can see the joint partners involved in this. This has been a collaborative process with the Waikato River iwi, who have been really helpful in helping us frame up how we deliver this report card. So just to cut to the chase of what it's likely to look like is something like this diagram I have behind me here. So we have in the whole report card, our big pizza there behind us, we have 8 different taura or strands of the rope. And so those include elements like the kai, water quality, people's experience of the river, their ecological integrity, also the water security, how the economy's going and how much effort is happening in the catchment. So the notion is that we will have, and a whole lot of indicators that come under each of those. So in the report card, people will see this summary state for the whole river or a part of the river, and then how the different attributes are faring in terms of their grade and which direction they're going. Are they getting better or worse? Now, for some of this in the initial report card, we may not have enough data, and so we'll still have it on the card, but acknowledge that that's an area where we need to do more. How this will be delivered in a bigger scale is shown on the next graph, which what we envisage with this report card is that it'll be a 6-pager, so it'll be a 3-page fold-out, and potentially this will be delivered quite widely around the catchment. So the middle of our 3-pager, having explained what the report card is, will have something that looks like this. So this is a mock-up of how the report card will be, with a schematic of the Waikato River from Lake Taupo to the port, and from the Waipa from Puriora to where it joins the Waikato. We've divided the different sub-regions, what we're calling report card units, into areas where it seems sensible there's a big enough chunk to summarise without where people have elements of interest in them. So these report card units either match up with the freshwater management units that are coming out of the collaborative stakeholder process, or they're subsets of that. So what people will be able to do, and the numbers here, this is totally a mock-up, don't get worried about these, they're all the same all the way down, it's not going to look like that in the end. But people can come and look at, if I'm interested in the upper Waikato River down to Lake Ohakuri from Hooker Falls, I can look at this and see what's the main stem state, what's the tributaries, and I'll have a bit of narrative about each of those. So this is, we think, a way of summarising a whole lot of complicated information that the public should be able to pick up and get. In the long term, this could be also used by the Waikato River Authority to look at how things are progressing with the spending of the clean-up fund in the catchment. Okay, so lastly, the Wheel of Water. This is a project that John Bright and his team, it's an MB-funded project that they've been doing, and this is again trying to look at how do we summarise information down into a simple-ish diagram that people can understand. It starts with using knowledge networks and causal loop diagrams, as you saw previously, to frame up the values, and then it goes on to try and synthesise the states of attributes in one drawing. Now, inside this wheel here, we have around the outside there are sort of very broad categories of economic values, recreational values, ecological, environmental values, and social values, social cultural values, with a number of sub-values within those. And then we've got 4 bands within it. So we've got, bad, poor, good, and bad, fair, good, and excellent. So similar to the bands that are proposed in the NOF. And we can see for different values how they're going, and so how is it spread broadly across the broad domains around here, and then for particular indicators within that. We can also use these to summarise scenario results, which is shown on this graph here, where what John has done is, for some South Canterbury streams, has looked at what happens when we go from a current baseline here to changing the minimum flow and allocation to leave more water in a river. So this is an environmentally conservative scenario. And so what this shows is the modelling output gets fed back into the Wheel of Water, and we can see that the supply reliability diagram here goes from being excellent to being good. And some of these things like the fish attributes here of short-finned eel and common bully going from being fair out to good. So it summarises all that in one view. So to summarise then, these knowledge networks and causal link diagrams help us with collective learning. They provide us with a consensus view of how the system works. They reveal some of the conflicts and some of the ways forward, and different people's worldviews. And people get to exchange their worldviews in the process of developing these. They do help us manage the complexity and limit setting. We go through a complex process to come out with something simpler. They help us to set our values in terms of deciding what our indicators and values are, to identify the win-wins and trade-offs. And then we've got these wheel of water and report cards, which help us sort of summarise complex data down into something more simple and manageable, which can be communicated to the public. So, with that, I thank you and happy to have some discussion.